I'd like to welcome everybody to Clergy Podcast. The world wants to know, and all the glory goes to God. I have a regular on the show, Mr. Sweeney, correct?
Yes, sir. R.A. Sweeney.
And I'm going to let him give a little bit of background information on himself for those of you who haven't seen this guy on my show before, loving every minute of it. With that being said, take it away.
Yeah, so thanks for having me back on the show. I think what we do, two or three episodes this last spring, and
Mm.
so just nice to be back with a familiar face, familiar voice, and be able to just dive a bit more into what God's doing. So background on me for anybody that's new to me. I am a huge nerd. I think we settled that pretty early on in me being on your show that I just, I taught myself Hebrew and Greek because I wanted to read Hebrew and Greek and have just done a lot of study in those areas and have books published and things like that. Just really love diving into original language things and seeing kind of what the bigger picture of what God has to say to his people is.
All right, that's wonderful. Now, what are we going to be talking about today?
As you and I were talking about a little bit, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Genesis 1. And you brought up this is an area that we've disagreed in the past. And, I'm back here on the show. You didn't exile me from the show, and I'm not staying away. So I love that we were able to disagree about it. I think that's something that, maybe we're going to be in the same sort of boat tonight. We'll see. But before I really dive in, I wanted to kind of frame this a little bit of, um, I was raised a Catholic, and so
Okay.
obviously very traditional views of Genesis that
Right, right, right.
God, this is the start of everything. There was nothing before. This is God shaping everything out of nothing. It's seven literal days. All those things that I'm going to call traditional because that's what the Western Church has traditionally believed. Um, and so I grew up with that. And honestly, I never really had a problem with that. Even growing up in public school, getting science, getting history, like all those things, never really questioned that. Was came to know Jesus in a Baptist church that was the
Mm.
same way. So I'm coming to the text with that very traditional Western church understanding. So as I start to disagree with some of those things, I don't want anybody thinking, oh, this is just some really progressive guy who's coming with his own agenda. Like, I didn't want my mind changed on any of this stuff. I was
Right,
very
right,
happy,
right.
and really have just been trying to look for what's actually going on in the
Mm.
text. And so wanted to frame that for everyone so that nobody thinks I'm just this, new age trying to change the Bible sort of guy. But I wanted to really I'd been doing a lot of research on cosmic time.
Mm.
So I'm reading an awesome book by a Jewish rabbi right now called The Sabbath, that is really getting into the time aspect of the Old Testament, and he doesn't, at least not yet, isn't getting into the New Testament. I don't expect him to go there because he's
Yeah,
Jewish. Um, but maybe
right.
we'll see where the book ends up. But been reading that, been doing a
Yeah.
lot of study on a lot of the different things with time, and started out with the term "in the beginning,"
Mm.
which I think a lot of people are probably going to be clenching up a little bit right now because it's an awkward topic to talk about. And so, what I wanted to do is just kind of present how the Bible uses this term. And really, like, I'm not trying to push anything here. I'm just wanting to show how the Bible is using this language. Because if we, I guess probably where I would want to start is the word that we see in Hebrew is Bereshit. Um, which is it's kind of a complicated word. It comes from a root and then has a couple add-ons in Hebrew, but that word breshit is what we translate as in the beginning. That whole phrase in English is that one Hebrew word. Um, and so if we just replace in the beginning with breshit and we say breshit, God created the heavens and the earth. If you didn't know that verse, Does anything in that verse really tell you what I mean by the word Bereshit? Just saying Bereshit, God created the heavens and the earth. It's very abstract in that there's no
Hmm.
contextual clues there.
Yeah.
Even if we move on, I don't think most readers would be looking at the rest of Genesis 1 and saying, like, Bereshit must mean in the beginning. The context doesn't necessarily say that. And so we're going to be looking at two types of passages. We've got contextual passages where the passage gives you the context for what we're talking
Hmm.
about. And then we'll have
Yep.
non-contextual passages. And so I would argue that Genesis 1:1 is very non-contextual. It doesn't inform what I mean by this word. Is that fair?
Pretty fair. Well, I'm a gap theory guy, so I'm all over the place.
Okay. Um, so that's my beginning argument is
Mm,
the narrative of Genesis 1 is not really cluing us into what we mean by this word.
mm, mm,
So it's a Hebrew word, like I said, and in the Old Testament, obviously it's not appearing in the New Testament because the New Testament's not in Hebrew. And we'll get into the Greek a little bit there
mm,
later. But in the Old Testament, we see Breshit get used about actually. It's Reshit, not Breshit, that gets used because the B at the beginning just means in.
yep,
So it's
yep.
in the Reshit. So Reshit gets used about 50 times in the Old Testament. Um, the most common way that you see this get used is talking about first fruit. And I'm going to even take that a little bit further. We see it paired a lot with another Hebrew word, bekarah, which is firstborn.
Mm,
And so we see all over, I should have gotten the numbers, but it's a vast, vast majority of the way that Reshit gets used in the Old Testament. We translate it in English as first fruit.
mm,
And out of it's something like 30 some times out of the 50-ish times, I think it's 51 total times we use this word, and 30 some times it's being translated as first fruit. Out of
mm,
those 30 some times, I'd say probably about 20 the language surrounding it has this word bekorah,
mm.
or bekori, or depending on exactly how it's conjugated, which is firstborn. So it's your first fruits and your firstborn.
Okay.
And so when we see those two together, it's kind of talking, your plants and your animals, but it's the first offspring that comes from it, seems to make a pretty good pattern. Even when we don't see it used in conjunction, we see it being used in a way that's describing when you're bringing in your sheet, your
Mm,
first fruits.
mhm,
Um, and so all over the place, uh, we see it used in that way. So that's probably what I would argue being the most, like far and away the most used. If I was to just look at all the uses and say, what does this word mean? I'd probably pick first fruits as just sheer numbers. I would say, oh, okay, this word seems to mean first fruit more than anything else. So it's got to mean first fruit. Now, if I'm going to take that back to Genesis 1, that still leaves a lot open, right? I mean, we could interpret Genesis 1 a lot of ways by saying, in the first fruit, God created the heavens and the earth. There's more ways that I could translate that.
mm.
Or interpret that. I could say that this is the first of the fruits of God, the first thing he ever did. Seems to fit
Wow, wow.
with our general understanding of in the beginning. But we also we
I
lose
think
a
the second translation is plausible though. In the beginning, the first thing he did was create the heaven and earth. That's
sure.
plausible. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, but so we could say this is the first fruit of God, the first thing he did, the first time he produced something. This is what he did. I think that's very fair to
Yeah, yeah,
interpret
yeah.
it that way.
I
We could
agree. I
also
agree.
interpret it when I think about the first fruit. If I have done if I have any knowledge of agrarian lifestyle, the first fruit is not the beginning of the task. it's actually kind of the end of your task. You've got the harvesting and that's, but like you have, like gotten your field prepped, you've sown, you have, weeded, you have tended, you've done all the things to finally get it here.
Mm.
So in that case, it's not the first thing that's ever done. It would be the first benefit that came out of the seeds that he planted. And so maybe I'm putting these out as maybes. I'm not arguing for any of these, but that it fits the story, and matching it with that idea of firstborn, the Bekorah that it gets coupled with, same sort of deal. You've had, the parents have had to become, able to breed. You have to have, the things that lead to pregnancy, the whole pregnancy,
Mm.
the labor, and then the firstborn comes after all of that. So I think it's very plausible from that one way that this gets used to say this could be the culmination of everything is the first fruits here. And then even then we have a few ways we could interpret that and say, okay, so creation, like the start, the dark and disordered that we see in Genesis 2 is the first fruit. Or we could say this is what it was like, the dark and disordered, and then by day 7, that's the first fruit that Genesis 1's talking about. So we've got some different ways that we could be looking at just the idea of first fruit. And like I said, that is far and away the most common usage of the word reshit. One thing that's really interesting is we do see all those are reshit, not breshit, which again, the B is just in.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very, very rare that it's in the reshit for any of those places. What we do see with the actual full term breshit there is, let me double check. I think it's in Jeremiah. I'm almost positive. Where did I write down? Here's Jeremiah. Yeah, so 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Yeah, 4 times, like right in a short period of Jeremiah, we see him use the whole term Bereshit in the Bereshit. And it's just in a few chapters. And in all of those, what he's saying is it's in the beginning of the reign of a king, which we can look at that the same way I was just talking about. Is it the beginning, or is it everything that now starting to produce the benefit of him being king? Like, it's not, you've got Jehoiakim and Zedekiah are two of are some of the kings that we're talking about. Clearly, they didn't just like spring up out of nowhere when they became king. They were born, they lived for however many years. And what's really interesting is that the first time it mentions the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, the Greek translation, the Septuagint, says in the 4th year of Zedekiah.
I got that Septuagint right here.
Right. And so if you look up, let me see, it's Jeremiah 28:1. In Hebrew, it says, in the reshit of the reign of Zedekiah. In Greek, it says, in the 4th year of the reign of Zedekiah. Which again, we're dealing with a different culture and trying to make sure that we are understanding how they're using their language rather than saying, this is how I use the language that you used. So Jeremiah, either he envisioned the reshit, the first fruits of the reign of Zedekiah, being a period, or the translators into the Greek envisioned it as a period. But somewhere in there, we're getting this word is not necessarily the very first thing. It's not, the second the crown touches his head. For this passage, it's 4 years later. It's in the 4th year. It could be closer to 5 years later.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, again, bringing that back to what I was just saying with the first fruits is day 1 the first fruits, or is day 7 the first fruits of days 1 through 6? We're seeing here that a period of time can be the reshit. The whole thing could be the reshit. And so I really want this to kind of just soften some of those misconceptions, or maybe not misconceptions, but those conceptions that we have. The one thing that I think is really important to note is out of the, I think, like I said, I think it's 51 times that you find this word in the Old Testament,
Mm,
reshit. I think there's only two that you could even make sense of the passage by making it be this is the first thing that ever happened. Like nothing happened before this point. Um, there's, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If you bring that context in, okay, yeah, you could make that verse say that. And there's one, maybe two other. You could put that meaning back into the passage and the verse still makes sense. Every single other one doesn't.
mm,
If we're saying, in the reshit of the reign of these kings, and you want to tell me that king didn't exist before that point, nothing ever happened before that point, even in his story, that that doesn't fit. If you want to tell me that the reshit, the first fruits that we were dealing with, that there was nothing before that point, we know
mm.
that's not how plants work. And it's um, coupled with the firstborn, and we know it's not that way with that. And
Right,
so
right.
I'm not saying that there's no way Genesis 1:1 is saying this is the very first thing that ever happened, because it could. It does fit if I put that in there. My point is almost everywhere we're seeing this term, that sort of language does not fit. We couldn't make
Mm,
that same meaning apply to it almost anywhere else. And to me, two to maybe three passages that it could fit the passage does not overwhelm 48, 49 passages that in no way could it. And there's
mm,
not a single one that the context is saying for sure what this means is there was never anything before, or even in the story of whatever we're talking about, there was nothing before this. It's really once this started to turn into something noteworthy
mm.
is what we're seeing there.
Well,
I've
when
been
you look
talking
at
a lot. I
when
wanted
you
to
look at
pause.
scripture, it's like a lot of times when it talks about the introduction of Elijah, he just shows up.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody gives us a background on what was going on before he decided to, answer the call of God and get those folks in order. So you got a good point there because a lot of times the Bible just gives us the information that starts at that point of time where God wants us to focus on. So sometimes stuff is like you kind of, well, what was going on before he showed up? So yeah, that
Right.
makes a lot of sense there. Yeah.
Well, and the I mentioned earlier that breshit is you've got a root word and then some stuff added onto it.
Right, right, right.
The root of it is rosh, which means head.
Mm.
And even the word rosh gets used in some pretty interesting ways.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
but it's like I think of like the headwaters of
yeah,
something.
yeah.
Like it's usually not the source of the water. It's just where it starts to turn into something, where it becomes significant. Um, I think of like a trailhead. I live out here in Wyoming, and if I am going to go to a trailhead, chances are I've driven along a road and I pulled over. There's a parking lot, there's a trailhead. Like it's not like there's nothing behind this point. It's just this is where it becomes significant. Um, and we see that all over the place where there is even like Jesus being our head, when it talks about the head of the Tower of Babylon's up in the cloud.
Mm.
I mean, it's talking about a prominent or significant thing. And so when I think about how the Bible's using the word head, and then I mesh that in. I mean, you have to be careful when you're doing this. You can't just well, this
Mm.
is head, and so I'm just shoving the word head into this word that's derived from it. So you have to think of like how linguistics work and all those things. But just thinking about like this is seemingly saying when all the work came to fruition,
Mm.
and the root of it is talking about when the significant, the important, the what we're trying to achieve is happening. Like the Tower of Babylon, we're trying to get the The point is to get the head up there, not to have the base up there. Jesus being our head, the ladder that Jacob sees has its head in the heavens, like all those things. The head is like the objective. The head can be the glory of something in a lot of different respects. It can be the leader of, and so
Mm,
bringing all that together, it really seems like this is the significant point, where this is turning into something
mm.
that we care about.
Well, Hebrew itself is an interesting language because I study both languages and stuff, and what I find that Greek has a tendency to be more precise, while Hebrew is kind of like, okay, in the culture, the Hebrew culture, and the way that word used, it could mean quite a few different things. Because when we start looking at the culture implications of the word head, that's always talks about the command center. That's why it talks about kill the head when it talks about in Genesis that the offspring of the serpent would bruise the feet and the offspring of the woman would bruise the head. Well, that's more significant, the bruising of the head when you look at everything behind it. So that word head in Hebrew, it's a lot to that word. And but when you read Greek, it's like, okay, this is precise, that's precise, that's precise. And Hebrew like, oh, wait a minute now. So I follow you on that. Yep, yep, yep.
Yeah, and there's a lot of symbolism in the Hebrew language that I
Yes,
feel like, to your
yes,
point,
yes, yes.
you don't really see quite as much in the Greek. And noteworthy to me is, um, there is the word for the round thing on top of our necks in Greek, which is kephale. That's not the word that the Septuagint uses for in the beginning. It's not saying in the head; it's saying in the arche,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah.
which again carries all those same sort of more, what we were just saying is more like symbolic meanings of head, like the could be the start, could be the significant point, could be the
Mm,
glory of
mm,
something,
mm,
the goal you're achieving, like carries all of those. And so it was, to me, it was really interesting diving into this because it's something that's so contested. And I can't even picture, having looked at this now, having someone who was brought up in these stories in Hebrew, even
mm,
thinking that way. And I'm not trying to discredit anybody who does think that way, but I'm just saying,
mm.
like, eh, there's a lot of evidence pointing the other way. So I think we need to hold it with a pretty open hand rather than a tight grip.
Yeah. So if I basically start off by saying, at first God created the heaven and earth, I wouldn't be wrong. I wouldn't be wrong at all. So, but of course, some people might have an issue with that, but it's not like I'm going out of the box with it. I'm just kind of like saying, well, at first, but we don't know what happened before he decided to do it at first and be created the heaven and earth. And that's another thing dealing with the whole time thing. So, it
Yeah,
gets
and
deeper.
so, to your point there, like, you can say this is the first thing that ever happened. There's a lot of ways that we could look into that.
Right,
You could say
right,
it's
right.
this is like the glory of God's work
Mm-hmm.
at that point.
Right, right,
It's the
right.
goal that he, like, if I want to say this is the goal that we were achieving, when I think of like the tower was trying to build its head into the heavens,
Right. Right.
when the ladder that Jacob saw had its head in, like, it's the goal. That's the story of the Bible. The heavens and the earth in unity with humanity and all creation in perfect harmony with God is God's purpose. It is his glory. Um, and so those definitions fit too. And I think to tease out, I think it's this one versus this, I think we'd be doing a disservice to the word. We've got this rich word, and I'm imagining God's meaning a lot of meaning with this.
Mm,
That
mm,
this is the goal I was working towards. This is my glory. This is the fruit of my labors. Like, it's all of those things together.
mm.
Um, and honestly, I feel like that's a big frustration that I have with some of the people who just kind of white knuckle doctrines, is you lose so much
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
can't
yeah,
if I
yeah.
can't explore without being labeled a heretic, uh, I I miss out on so much of what God's saying, what He's doing, all of those things, and it's just, there's a richness in the having the flexibility to explore and to really see what God's word really says. And
Mm,
the danger is there's a lot of ways that someone could go astray. And I wouldn't want, everyone just having free reign with whatever idea you come up with. Well, that's just the
mm,
freedom that God allowed. Well, you got to base it in something. And that's why I did this study. I went through the 51-ish times this word's used, looked at the other words that the Bible uses from the same root and how they get used. I spent some time digging into how's the Bible using it so that the Bible's shaping those ideas, not,
mm,
tradition or my preconceived notions or those sorts of things.
mm. Well, saying from the experience of teaching a couple of books a couple of times, I can say this: there's layers of information in Scripture. Like I've taught the Book of Revelation a couple of times. Every time I teach it, I find something new that I go, "Wow, where'd that come from?" And like, okay, it was there. I just missed it, and God gave me another layer. So, and if that's just dealing with the English. So when you're adding Hebrew and Greek in, those are other layers that are going to just, we got to now take a look at the chapter once again and make sure we're actually giving the message that was given to the original recipient of it, and then see how we're going to apply it to the modern times. And that's another task within itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
so to me, I based what the research I did here based off of some work that I read from John Walton.
Mm,
He did, similar study on a like similar method of like let's just take every single instance and start looking for themes in the way this word gets used. Um, and I don't know if it was his original method or not, but that's where I got the idea was just like we have these ideas because in English, when I read in the beginning, I think must mean in the beginning. And if you want to tell me that that actually is not the beginning, I'm going to say, but it says in the beginning. Um, but to be able to say, like, let's really look at,
mm,
how this word gets used in all of its context. I mean, ideally, we'd want to be looking in other literature as well, but at the same time, if I go to a non-biblical source to see how that language gets used, it might not be the same meaning. Just like Paul might use a word and Peter might use the same Greek word, and they
mm,
could mean different things because it's a different author. Even more so if I were to go to some non-biblical Hebrew text to see how they're using
mm.
Reshit, I might not get quite as close of meaning, but the more we know how the word gets used, the wealth of meaning in any of these words, the more we're going to understand how they fit together to better make sense of the passages.
Yeah, well, Apostle Paul, his Greek is really hard because he makes up stuff. So,
He does.
like, come on, Paul, stop it, man. I gotta
But
sit down, drink some water, and breathe before I go back.
but just like in that one Marvel movie, all words are
Yeah,
made up words. So
yeah, 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 yeah.
um, the
So
one other
yeah.
thing that I did want to point out with this is there is another Greek word. It's from, or not Greek, another Hebrew word. It's from the same root of Rosh, which is
Mm,
head.
mm,
Um, and it's Rishon,
mm,
which when you look up the word Rishon instead of Reshit, that really does mean first. Like it is the sort of like numbering or ordering sort of language. So if I wanted to say the first thing, the former things, the beginning
mm,
things, Rishon does seem to fit better.
mm,
And again, I'm not trying to tell anybody what they should do with this data. To me, that's just another piece of evidence that's convincing me that I don't think this is the first thing that ever happened, that nothing existed
right,
before this
right,
point.
right, right,
Um,
right.
but again, I would hope anybody who's listening would come to their own conclusions from this. But just another piece of data that there's another word that in Hebrew probably would communicate that Western traditional idea of nothing and then this point before we
Mm,
get to everything else. There's a different word to describe that point, probably a little bit better. It is from the same root, but it's just a different word.
mm. So, but when we consider this, we know that God itself existed. He didn't create it. He's always been, first and last. So the question is, what was he doing before he decided to put a planet Earth, into the whole game plan? This is in his theater because it's his theater. And it was interesting. I was reading some things about, God's universal laws and said, and what it said was because this covenant comes from God, it makes it universal. And I said, wow, I never thought about it like that. Because, when you think about covenant, you just think about, the children of Israel and all that stuff and the covenant he's making in the Bible. But the author's argument was that because he's the God of everything and he's sovereign, he can apply his covenant to everything. And I said, well, a minute, I don't know if I want to go with that or not. And then I had to think on it, go, this guy's out the box. So, and then I step back and look at it and go, well, possible. Possible. It's enough to draw your brain though, because that's something that I'm not used to hearing. Usually I'm usually hearing the traditional approaches to everything. Because you run that yourself. You get a traditional meaning, and professors always tell you in the Greek language and Hebrew, go with the traditional definition of the word. They stress that. And then there's a second meaning, a third meaning, and a fourth meaning. And then you go, well, why they choose that meaning? Well, everybody chose that meaning. I go, hmm. And then when you brought up the point, well, it means first, which I went with your second explanation was at first he created everything. Now I could go with that. I could go with that, but it still gets kind of like, well, is there any harm being done? No, it's not. It's just telling you to think about how the word can use. Because when we do etymologies of any word, we already go down a rabbit hole anyway. So
Sure. And really what kind of kicked me off with doing like spending because I knew what I thought and this didn't really confute any of what I'd already been thinking based on a lot of study. But I really wanted to go through this and get kind of the data more or less
mm,
because I was talking with a gentleman who he had his idea of what Genesis 1 meant. And he was darn sure I was going to hear every word of it.
let's
But
hear it.
but he didn't have any reason.
Right, 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 right,
Well,
right,
this is
right.
what it says. Well, it's what it says in English. Well, it's plain language. Well, if it's a poem, plain language reading isn't the best reading. And I've heard that argument a lot. Well,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
a literal reading's always going to be the best reading. No, it's not.
yeah.
If
Well,
you want to read my text message threads to people and you think everything I said there's literal, you're going to think a lot of things about me that aren't true. Like that's just not how language works. I can't just
right, right,
apply
right.
this is the right way to read something no matter what. Um, and so I kept asking him, like, well, why do you assume that that has to be? Well, that's just how, why wouldn't it be that way? Well,
Mm.
and
Yeah,
so I wanted
I
to
get
have
it.
the
I get it.
data
I get it.
of being able to say, like, nothing in the linguistics is saying that's a necessity. At least you're making this a necessity, and nothing about the Bible is making this a necessity. And really, we see so much like this is probably one of the most debated issues that I come across is do you just read a Western traditional understanding of this passage that that this is how it is, because if not, you won't believe the rest of the Bible.
Hmm,
Well,
hmm,
guess
hmm,
what? I
hmm.
don't think that this is a literal exact, like I think it's meant to be a poem using figurative language, doing a lot of things, not because it's convenient for me, but because I've researched it. I've spent thousands of hours studying just the beginning of Genesis. And I'm very, very convinced of what it's doing. And I do believe in the whole Bible. I believe
Hmm.
the rest of the Bible. So this did not undermine my understanding at all. And it's rooted in actually trying to understand what's being said rather than, just I need to believe this or everything will fall apart, which is what I feel like so many people come
Well,
from.
you'd be surprised how many times I get in trouble when I tell people, how come that's not symbology and why are you taking it in a literal sense?
Mhm.
So you'd be surprised how many times people gave me the mean face. And when you do a literal interpretation all the time, Well, you got some snake charmers out there that felt like they can handle rattlesnakes because the Bible says you can handle serpents and stuff. And of course, I'm not saying it word for word, but you could take up serpents and
Right.
that thing. So somebody read that, took a literal approach, and now he's walking around getting bit by rattlesnakes. And of course, the couple times you get bit, you may not die. Then your body develops immunity to it. Now you get bits all the time. Now everybody thinks you're a prophet. Well, no, there's some biology behind that.
Sure. Sure.
But
Yeah, and just what you and I have done on this show, one of the reasons I really like being on this show is we don't always agree, but we do have the same passion that we want to see the church unified.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and to me, this is something that was worthwhile um, in that conversation because there are so many people who are just indoctrinated
yeah,
in I
yeah.
have to believe this. You can't not believe this and be a Christian. Like there's that sort of just it's almost like superstition. If I stop thinking this is exactly this, then my whole thing will fall apart. It's not.
Mm,
Like let's have some room here. Let's be able to disagree. And like if this is important to you, like okay, but like if you want to label me a heretic because I believe differently, well, I'm sorry. I have a lot of evidence to point the other way.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and I feel like to me, the more we look at this, the more we look at these sorts of things, the more we have freedom to really be open with God and explore God, which is scary, but that's what the Christian faith is all about. It's not,
mm.
Judaism was very big on rules. Because that's
True.
what Adam and
Yeah.
Eve chose. They were like, hey,
Hmm.
instead of obedience, their relationship, I mean, what if we'll be righteous on our own? And God's like, okay, here's what it looks like, a bunch of rules. And it never worked. And then Jesus came and was like, what if we just go back to what we had in the garden where it's a relationship instead of rules? Um,
Mm,
and everybody is welcome to be a rule follower, and as long as you do it perfectly your entire
mm.
life, I believe that you will be just fine in the end. You just can't
Right,
ever
right,
mess it
right,
up
right,
once
right,
ever.
right.
um,
Well, that's another big argument. Is the law done away with, or can we keep some of it? And when you go down that rabbit hole, you're going to really get a lot of chapters getting quoted in the New Testament off of that one. So,
sure,
but welcome to my world. I'm a non-denominational pastor, and everybody hates me. So,
there you go. Well, I
like,
don't.
pick a team, Michael.
Team unity is the side that I pick.
Yeah, well, that's what I think that is important. That if you have the gift of teaching, which is a gift that comes from God, then your job is to teach. And sometimes when you teach things, you have the tendency to rattle somebody's cage, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
And people don't like their cages rattled. They like to be, okay, this is what they told me when I was 7 years old, and I'm staying with it. Well, you're 27 now. You thought about maybe dissecting the stuff and looking a little further and looking a little deeper and pull a couple more layers back. So
Yeah,
that's something that I think we human beings we like to be comfortable, and we like to
we
be
do.
comfortable in our interpretations. We want to say, well, this is what the Bible says, and then, well, wait a minute now. Are you sure that's what it says? 'Cause are we looking at it from a symbolic, like I was talking earlier? Is it symbolic? Is it literal? Is it a metaphor? Is it poetry? What is it? Because there's a couple chapters I make a poetic argument for, and it really upsets people. I'm not going to mention it because people start throwing stones at me. But anyway, it's in Thessalonians. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Now I kind of want to dive into that on the next time I'm on. We'll
Yeah,
we'll
I
table
know,
that for
right?
now, but
We'll leave that one alone right now. So I've rattled a lot of cages with that one, but you made a good point there. Whenever you deep dive into a word, it's interesting because you get the first interpretation, which there was written all over the place, and then you get a couple other words in there, and then you got to wonder, well, if this word pops up in another passage, you know, how can we use it? Because you don't want to just start changing the whole way the stuff is interpreted, but you have to consider it, and then you have to ask the question: has anyone else came up with an alternative interpretation of a commentary? And that's why I read a lot of different commentaries, because sometimes I'll read a commentary from one guy and go, "That's a traditional commentary," and then I read a commentary from somebody else and I go, "Wait a minute, this guy took a left turn." So, and you got to ask why he take a left turn, then you got to listen to his argument. So, like you, I think we should chase the data. and find out what it says. So
Well, and that's the thing too of nobody wants to listen to somebody else's argument.
yeah,
Like I've
that's
got my
true.
mind made up.
Yeah,
Why would I care
mm,
what you have to say about it? Because,
yeah,
you know, you're going to be wrong. I've already decided you're wrong if you don't agree with me.
hmm
So why would I bother listening to your argument?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and that's it's a recipe for a bad theology. It's a recipe for
hmm
bad relationships. You know, if I want to say that I loved my neighbor and I'm coming to them with a you're automatically wrong, I'm not loving that person. And that I think is really what it mostly boils down to is am I willing to love my neighbor enough to consider other views? Am I willing to love whoever the author of, in this case, Genesis is enough to really try to understand what they were trying to communicate with this? Am I willing to love God enough to, explore what he meant rather than just accepting, face value, is there something potentially more? And it all comes down to that, do I have the love to see this through?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that a good communicator is always a good listener, and most people are already orchestrating their rebuttal while you're talking instead of listening to see if you're presenting any new information. And a lot of times I like listening because when I listen, I get new information. So you can't just be orchestrating your rebuttal every time you have a theological conversation with somebody. And you can really usually tell when that happens because their eyeballs are in creative mode. Hey, this guy's not even listening. He's ready to hit me with the full thesis he's got on this topic.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So what else you got going on? What was the last book you wrote?
Well, let's see. So it is, at least as we're recording this right now, it's the 11th, which means 10 days ago, on the 1st, I released my prayer book on Psalms.
Hmm.
Um, so that one was tricky because, you can really look at Psalms and say it's 150 prayers. Um, as I've been going through my series, because I started this all the way back in Genesis, as I've been going through the series, if no one is addressing God or talking about addressing God, I'm not considering it prayer or discussion of prayer.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and so, even though I think you could pray all of the Psalms, and I think some of them maybe are meant to be prayerful, I think of like, Paul all the time, right? It's like the grace of God be with you all. That wasn't addressed to God. Am I invoking God to do something? Yeah, probably. But like, I didn't pray. I'm more just I'm talking to you if I say that, right? And
Hmm.
so I was judicious about how I wanted to do that. And so out of 150 Psalms, there's I think like 100 of them ish were what I considered to be have prayers. But so I went cover to cover, and everywhere that there was prayers, we did a little case study on that, and so that was really
Hmm.
cool because it features all my own translations of Hebrew. I translated, I think I had told you before, I translated the whole book of Psalms as I was writing that.
Hmm. Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
and so that one was really cool. Right now, we're in the middle of doing my Advent devotional that I released in 2024, called The Shoot of Jesse, which was pretty cool. And so yeah, kind of right now I just finished the manuscript of that prayer series. So I just finished book 7, which is getting through, Acts through Revelation. So I just finished it after years of writing. I think it's 4.5 years I've been writing that series and
Hmm.
still working
Hmm.
on publishing and whatnot. But
Okay.
kind of winding that down and looking at some more projects coming up that I'm excited to do too. So lots of irons in the fire.
Well, Psalms has a lot of Bible history in it as well. And the last time I was teaching, one of the things I had somebody read one of the Psalms all the time, and it's just a wealth of information in the Psalms. And I think a lot of people overlook the Psalms because they sometimes go into, let me find a feel good chapter in here or a feel good verse. I said, wait a minute, when you read the Psalms, you're getting the history of the Bible in there as well. So I think a lot of people forget about that part because when we think about the historical books, we think about books like, Jeremiah, Exodus, and, the other historical books in there. And then, of course, we consider Psalms to be the poetry of the Bible and stuff. But I don't know. I think you could kind of like classify them as historical books as well when you read them and pay attention to what you're reading. So I'm sure you saw that after doing your deep dive into it. So,
Well, and it's helpful to you and I have mentioned Tanakh before on the show,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, and so Psalms starts out the third section of Tanakh, the
Mm,
Ketuvim, which is the writings of the people.
yeah.
Um, in at least the Jewish groups that followed Tanakh ordering, which I think was most, the Ketuvim was considered the least authoritative.
Mm,
And we have this idea that if it says it in the Bible, it's not only true, but it's right. Um, and so, like if it says it, then I can, base my life off of it. And it's like,
mm,
well,
mm,
there's a
mm.
lot of things where it's telling you bad things that happened.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I think of like Job. There's a lot in Job where it's people giving bad theology. Don't build your someone. I forget what it was, but I saw someone on Facebook or whatever had posted something that was like, "Here's my view of this theology that doesn't really matter to anything, but I'm going to be really pushy about it." And they had quoted. Um, one was from Job. Where was the other one from? But it was two passages he quoted from where it
Mm.
was somebody giving bad theology.
I've heard
And I'm
that a
like,
lot.
so your point that you're making is that we should listen to like Job's friend who God
Yeah,
says
yeah,
is
yeah.
wrong, and this other person that God had said like don't listen to that guy.
Mm,
Um,
mm, mm. That's a
and
good
but
point.
so like with the Psalms, when you come to it with it's not necessarily giving me a theology lesson in terms of, when it talks about like you split the head of the sea dragon. It's not saying that there was an actual sea dragon that God split. That's using Babylonian language,
Mm,
like the Enuma Elish language to paint a word picture.
yep, yep.
And it's not all necessarily condonable, but it's true. It really captures our wrestlings with
Hmm.
brokenness and emotion and bringing those things to God. And I always think of is it 137, 138? It's right in there. The when we were going by the rivers of Babylon, in slavery, the guards were demanding we sing some of our traditional songs. And how are
Mm,
we supposed to sing songs of Jerusalem when it's just been destroyed? Our grief is too near. And it ends with Babylon, Babylon, the good life belongs to the person who dashes your babies to pieces on rocks.
pretty
And
heavy.
one school of thought is to say, well, it must be good to murder Babylonian babies. That's what it says here, must be
Right,
true.
right, 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 right.
But when you really get what the Sins are trying to do is say this is what the people felt. This is an honest wrestling. Like this person is just broken and has so much anguish and hate for these people that they felt that way. And that's honest and it's okay. It's not good to act on it. It's not good to live there, but it's okay that you got to like you brought it up. You brought it to God
Mhm.
to say like this is where I'm feeling, and it gives you like it's trying to flesh that out and saying bring this
Mm,
to God. I get that you feel this way. I understand the feeling that you have here, so bring it to me
mm,
and we'll do this together. And to me, when you start looking at it that way of like these are not theology lessons, but they are really more like lessons on the human heart, like
mm,
showing you how humanity has wrestled with things. It really
mm.
takes a new shape that I think is really
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. I think a lot of people fail to realize that these are human beings and that their actions are being recorded. Now, when you read a part that says, "Thus says the Lord," it's time to really pay attention to what the Lord said. But if Jeremiah is talking to somebody and they're having a conversation, but if Jeremiah says the Lord said, that means that he's giving a direct message from Jeremiah. So then again, I think a lot of the problem is that when we read the Bible, like you just said, and I'll go back to the book of Job. After his three friends come or four friends comes, the rest of it you can pretty much just overlook and get back to go to the point where God says, "Where were you, Job, when I hung the morning stars into the sky?" And it's talking about the constellations and everything, and that's when you can start paying attention. But the rest of that stuff in between It's like, wow, those are some real great friends Job has. They're like, those are the guys you want to come see you in the hospital.
Well, and think about how much of their theology sounds right, though. Like, I agree, they're
Yeah,
awful friends. Hey, Job, maybe if you weren't a dirtbag, this wouldn't have happened to you.
pretty
Um,
much.
um, but a lot, like I find myself when I read it, I'm like, well, that seems right. But God said, and so then you're starting to, depending on how deep you want to go with it, then you're piecing apart like, where are they in error here? What
Mm.
parts of what they're saying are true and what parts aren't? And that's where Torah is important, because Torah being, you've got the writings are the words of the people.
Hmm.
The prophets are the words of God through the prophets, but then the Torah is
Mm.
considered directly out of the mouth of God.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's
Yeah,
where
yeah.
even the prophets, couldn't speak apart from the Torah. If they were speaking something against the Torah, they'd be stoned as a That's why they wanted to
Mm.
stone Jesus, because they're like, you're speaking against the Torah. Paul,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
speaking it. And they weren't, but they thought that they were. And so
Mm.
um, that'd be an interesting deal too, to really just dive through the friends language, or even
Yeah,
Job's probably
yeah,
too, and just say like, like where are we on track, where are we off track, what, because it's
yeah,
slight differences here,
yeah.
not huge.
Well, just think if somebody didn't read the very first part of Job, where the adversary goes to, the Most High God and says, and God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And he says, "Well, how can I touch him? You got this wedge of protection on it." Just think if somebody started like maybe in chapter 10 and didn't read the first couple. Oh my goodness, he's talking about a mess. A mess is about to happen right there. So it's
Yeah.
very important that you get a good understanding of the first chapter. And then a lot of people today say, "Well, I'm suffering the same that Job suffered." He says, "Wait a minute, you're telling me that the adversary went to the throne of God, and God said to the adversary, 'Have you considered my guy Steve?'" I don't think it happened that way. I really don't think that. So I think Job was given to us to show us an example, and this is my hypothesis. It's an example of how God trusts and knows that those that love him will not betray him. I think that's the big message of the book of Job. Because when I think about that, when we look all throughout the Bible, we always see that even those that follow Christ, like Peter doubted Jesus 3 times, and he was all over the place. But at the end, Jesus restored Peter, and he became one of the spearheads of establishing the first century church. So when we take a look at Job and what is the real message in Job, is it about you're going through trials and tribulations and this is God's plan for you? Well, I don't believe that's the plan, even though it rains on the just as well as it rains on the unjust. But I believe that we have to look at a more spiritual, deeper meaning about this battle that goes on between the adversary and Christ. So
Well, and I think too, so I agree with what you're saying, not disagreeing, but I think too, like just going back to what we started out with, of like those friends came with what they had decided about Job.
yeah,
And they're like,
exactly.
hey, and they start out gently, like, hey, well, have you repented? Like usually when these
Yeah,
things
yeah,
happen, it's because the person is sinful,
yeah, yeah,
which
yeah.
isn't true. Jesus even affirmed, like, that's not how God does things.
Right, right,
Um,
right, right.
but they came with their understanding, and they're like, well, have you tried repenting? Like, did you think maybe you did this or that? And he's like, no, I didn't do any of those things. And at that point, I don't think the friends had done anything inappropriate. They're trying to be helpful. But
Mm,
then they double down and then triple down of like, well, no, like my theology has to be true, which means you must have done something. Like all three of there's the fourth one later, but the three main friends, their whole point is you had to have done something terrible. Just
mm,
confess, repent, and like you can move on with life. And I think of all, like we've got so many people who are coming with their theology, and well, I guess at the end too, like Job, who is righteous in the end, is like,
mm.
I'd heard about you with my ears, now I see you with my eyes, and I'm putting my hand over my mouth, and I won't speak again because I was an idiot. to think, to speak about who you are. And in the friends, God's like, you're all gonna die. Like straight up, you're toast unless Job here prays for you. Which crazy to think about. Um, like if Job is about to pee his pants over what he said that God said was right,
Mhm.
the friends, like how much more so? And so if I'm going to argue with someone and say like my theology is right, yours is wrong, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not going to
Mhm.
like if I have to be that pushy, and that's what I see a lot in evangelical circles around where I live, is just really pushy Christianity and pastors
Yeah,
pushing
yeah,
people to be pushy about it. And um, the idea that like, well, if you love someone, you won't stop until they convert. Like, no, like love happens before ministry. Love happens before apologetics. Like it's not the same. It's you love them, so you wanna share with them and you want them converted, but first you're gonna love that person exactly
right,
as they
right,
are,
right, right.
which is
Yeah.
what I see skipping a lot. But to come in with that pushy attitude, to me, like Job is a great example of like I'd be terrified
Mm.
because ultimately, like I'm gonna share with people who want to hear. If anybody doesn't want to hear,
Right, right.
they don't want to hear it. And if I share with someone and they disagree, okay, I shared something that I thought would be a blessing to you, but I'd rather love you than make you hate me and what I have to say and the
Mm.
gospel. And like you're not ready to hear this right now. Or maybe I'm
Yeah,
just wrong.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I always used to say all the time, you can tell when you got two believers. If they have a disagreement and one says, well, let's open up the Bible and look at it. And the other one says, okay, let's open it up together. And they both read it together to see if there is what is the right path to take or the right translation to take. But some people say, well, I ain't got to open up no Bible because I know what it says. Well, okay, all right. You might as well just stop and start talking about baseball now because it doesn't really matter. But when you get somebody who's willing to open up the Bible with you and you say, well, in this chapter it says this, and we go down to this verse, and I'm making my point based on these four verses, right? And the person might say, wait a minute, I see that. Because I've had that happen to me where somebody says, hey Mike, listen, let's look at this again. And I go, wait a minute, let's look at it again. And I go, hey, that's a good point because when you're on a platform, you can't be thinking that you're up here and everybody's down here. Because
Absolutely.
I think the most humbling experience I had was I don't know if you was born back then, 1991. Were you around
I was
1991?
alive in 91, Michael. Not quite that young.
But around 91, 92, and it was like the first time I went to seminary school, and one of my coworkers said, "Mike, you think you're the only one that read the Bible?" And that was a real humbling experience for me. And I said, no more will I bring that type of energy, and I wasn't even teaching yet. I was still in my learning phases. I said, I will never bring that type of energy again, ever again in my life. So, and I think that's important for teachers to understand that you're not the only one that reads the Bible. There's always somebody who's got a bunch of books in their room and they're reading it all the time. They're a nerd, not like you. They're a wannabe nerd, but not as nerdy as you. I mean, but I'm making my point that there's always somebody out there that dedicates a lot of time to just trying to figure out what does the Bible say. So
Well, and I was actually just on a different podcast, last week, I think, and we were talking about the host was saying we tend to put up our walls and we defend our walls and we close the gates, and in the kingdom, all the walls are going to be torn down. And I agreed, but I was like, if
yeah,
I were
yeah,
going to phrase it, I would say all the gates are going to be opened because we have this idea of unity is assimilation, that if we're going to be united, we have to be the same. And I think the coolest part of, honestly, the coolest part of sin is the way God reconciles it all back into good.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so,
yeah,
like,
yeah. Mhm.
Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden. God planned a garden. They get kicked out. Their son Cain builds the first city. New creation is a hybrid of a garden and a city. humanity comes together at the Tower of Babylon and they're trying to overthrow God. God scatters their language and makes all the
Mm,
different people groups. The kingdom of God is all the people groups brought back to bring all that diversity together.
mm,
And so
mm,
I liked the idea of the walls staying up, just the gates being open, because it's not all one, like you see in a lot of the metropolitan areas where the cities just grow together and it's like, well, where's one? No, like there's differences. Like that's, some of this stuff and that's some of this stuff, but you're open, you're welcome. There's no defending from each other. You're just sharing all of your distinctness rather than homogenizing.
I think the book of Acts is just really makes that point really good because now the Israelites, the Hebrews, they have to now what are we gonna do with the Gentiles now? You know,
Right.
or we're gonna make them follow the law, and then of course Paul and Benjamin at the Jerusalem Council in Acts, they go there and figure out, well, what are we gonna do? Because all these years they're under the Mosaic law. Okay, then you got the crucifixion of Christ, the resurrection of Christ. Of course, the church gets ripped into, and then now we have a new theological perspective that he has to unpack. First, God has to unpack it to his apostles, and now the apostles have to unpack it to the rest of the world. And it's like, okay, this is not a good look because we're in a city dominated by Second Temple Judaism. Number one, they got all the power, and they already don't like us anyway because we're following, Jesus Christ, and they called him a troublemaker. So they had their work cut out for you. But when you look at it, you see Apostle Paul, when he goes out into the synagogues, he goes to the Gentiles, he goes to the kings and queens. And then, of course, Peter and the rest of the disciples do the same thing. So we see that they're they're bringing in a diversified community of different believers. And if you read the book of Acts, they can't come up with that conclusion. I'm gonna say, well, I don't think we read the same book, did we?
Yeah, I definitely agree there. And I mean, given the season right now, we're coming up on Christmas, and there's a lot of holidays that I feel like have been paganized in unhealthy ways.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but just think of like the most of what we do for Christmas is based on just bringing cheeriness to the dark time of year. Like it's light
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
darkness.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
the
yeah.
live tree in the middle of the dead of winter. It's just this bringing beauty into the unbeautiful is
Yeah,
what most
yeah,
of our Christmas traditions are based
yeah,
off of. And yes, they came from
yeah,
pagan cultures,
yeah,
but they're
yeah.
not idolatry like I feel like certain other ones are. And I'm not going to start that debate,
But
um, but
I
like
gotta jump. Yeah,
a
yeah.
Middle
Go
Eastern
ahead. Yeah,
Christmas,
yeah, yeah.
like the traditional story of
Mm,
Christmas doesn't have it. I mean, it's got the themes, but like the imagery that we all love, the beauty
mm,
of it, of a lot of our festivities and like the
mm,
decorations and stuff is in that mixing of the cultures where we've got the birth of the Messiah bringing the life that's in the dead place, the light and the darkness, all those things.
mm.
Then it's the practices of these other cultures that have mixed in that it just enrich the whole thing and make it that
Right,
much
right, right.
better.
Well, I did a deep dive on that word Christmas, and you break it down: Christ, Mass. And what happened was the church were aware of the fact that there was a pagan holiday going through that same time. They were aware of all this. And they decided that they wanted to have a special communion for the birth of Christ on that same time frame, which was during the darkest day of the day is when we go into the, I think it was the equinox or something, the
Mhm.
equinox,
The solstice.
the solstice, yeah. So they chose the darkest day because they were aware of the pagan stuff that was going on. So the church said, we're going to counterattack all that stuff and we're going to have a special communion for the birth of Christ. And what happened during the process where everybody latches on to the pagan part, but they don't understand why the church chose that date. Now, somebody said to me, Mike, you think they could have chose another date? I says, well, but their logic was this, that since Jesus brought the light of life into the world, we're going to pick that date because it's the darkest day of the year. So that's the logic behind it. Now, some people say, well, I don't care. The Bible says don't celebrate the birth of Christmas, birth of Jesus. I says, okay, I'm gonna celebrate the birth of Jesus.
Yeah, I feel like it was important to me in my
Yeah,
life,
yeah.
so I'm
So
going to
yeah,
celebrate it. And I fully agree. Like it absolutely does line up with pagan traditions pretty
yeah,
well,
yeah,
and
yeah.
we're doing the practices with the tree inside and wreaths,
Mm,
but none
yeah,
of that
yeah,
was like like the Easter bunny is like a fertility symbol that is
yeah, yeah. That's true,
correlated to the
true,
deities
true.
of that season.
Yeah, that's
Is like
pretty awful.
all the research I've done, like the trees were brought inside because it was just kind of dead inside and they wanted something
Yeah,
nice looking. And like the lights, it's really dark this time.
yeah, yeah,
And so the traditions, even though it was a pagan holiday, the traditions that they were doing were really very just practical of just making their home feel homier and their
yeah, yeah,
darkness feel
yeah,
brighter. And so to me, I don't see that we've really adopted the other than the timing, but it's
yeah,
the holiday wasn't really that pagan to begin with. It was mostly just the pagans were celebrating, like, hey, days are going to start getting longer. I live in Wyoming. It gets
yeah,
dark at
yeah,
like 2 o'clock
yeah,
here. And I'm like, I'm
yeah,
ready for December 21st. So it'll start brightening up some more
yeah.
too.
I think the person they was worshiping was the unconquered sun, I believe. I think that's the name of the person they was honoring on that day. But it was some guy that was
Okay.
given honor to. So yeah, of course I had this conversation with a family member of mine. He said, "Well, Mike, I'm not saying you're wrong, but still, it's a pagan holiday." I said,
I'm not saying you're wrong, but more realistically, I am saying you're wrong. I
yeah,
just don't want to say it.
but when you think about it, I've been celebrating Christmas for a long time, and I never woke up in the morning and go, "Oh, Christmas tree, thank you for the presents." Here's a blood offering. I just cut a ghost throat and put it under here. I never did that. So,
You don't slaughter a pig underneath your Christmas tree every morning?
not lately.
Weird. Maybe in the kitchen, right?
Yeah, exactly. When I eat the unclean food. Yeah. So, all right, man. So this has been wonderful. It's always a great time talking with you, and having a conversation with you on these topics and stuff. And you've definitely have enlightened me on at first God created the heaven and earth. So next time I teach the book of Genesis, I might say that everybody will probably give me the mean face, but that's okay. I'm gonna send them
Well,
in your direction when they do it, though.
that's fair. Like I said, I did the research for some writing projects that I'm doing, so I'll be, putting it to paper at some point here in the next, who knows when I'll actually get around to it. But it's for a book that I'm going to want to do at some point too.
So
So
where can people find your books at? Have you ever sent me a link to your books before, or
I believe I have. I don't know. I always point people to Amazon just because everybody knows Amazon.
okay?
Uh, and I've had some issues with just some things end up on Christian books, some things don't, and some of them like they'll be up and then they come back down. I don't know. Amazon's my go-to. It's easiest, but I mean you can get them anywhere. If you have a local
Yeah, yeah,
bookstore,
yeah.
even they should be able to order it in for you.
Okay.
There's like one book network that's everywhere, and it's in that network, so
Right, right, right,
you
right,
can
right.
find it just about anywhere
Yeah.
if you ask for it.
So just go ahead and send me a link so when I post this podcast up, people can look in and say, okay, I'll check his books out. You never know.
Yeah,
Somebody might decide that they want to pick your brain for a while and read all your books and see what they can come up with. You never know.
work works
Well,
for me.
definitely. Well, once again, thank you for being on the show. You're a great guest. You're always welcome back on my show. When you have an interesting topic, you just let me know. And I want to wish you and your family a Merry Christmas. Can I say that? A Merry Christmas.
You pagan.
I know,
Uh,
right?
But no, you as well. And
And a
thank you for
Happy New
having me back
Year.
on.
And thank you. And hope to be talking to you soon.
Sounds great.
All righty.